The prestigious Alzano Imperial Academy for Mages has its name, savoring in all its glory. Being one of the most remarkable training institutes for magic users, and I'm talking advanced Harry Potter things here, the Academy is also known to be the best school for mages in all of the Alzano Empire. It is quite unfortunate, though, that the arrival of a substitute professor is about to end it all. Along with Rumia and Sistin's hope for a passionate subteacher, their worst nightmare comes crashing down on them. Literally. In a moment of reflex, Sistin's magic knocks Glenn away before impact. Realizing her mistake, she apologizes to him for her sudden reaction. At first, Glenn starts as a somewhat charming, young, and enthusiastic man who thinks he's some superior god of beauty. Yet his action towards Rumia proves him to be a narcissistic dimwit. I'd give $10,000 for some character development here, like seriously. Sistin, who turns out to be the temperamental friend, gets upset and fires another magical blast that sends him flying and then swimming. The girls head to class, but it seems that's not the end of their encounter with Glenn. Afterward, Sistin and Rumia sit in a class filled with their mates while expecting the arrival of their tardy new homeroom professor. While they wait, there's a bit of tension in the room as the new professor is nowhere to be found for half of the lecture time. The tension reaches its peak when a sluggish-looking man waltzes into class and introduces himself as Glenn Radars. The look on Sistin and Rumia's faces are priceless. Surprisingly, their new professor happened to be the same man that they met at the town square. The only difference is, Glenn now looks like he was hit by a bus. Glenn attempts to introduce himself further, but Sistin, the temperamental one of course, still has unresolved issues with him. You would not believe it if I told you the next thing Glenn does. It's to give them pages to study while he takes a nap in class. Turns out, he's not too enthusiastic about the job after all. Sistin relentlessly urges Glenn to get the class going, and exhausted from her tantrums, Glenn finally gets up to teach the class. As if the lack of charisma wasn't enough, Glenn's handwriting is terrible, not to mention how boring and confusing his explanations are. The students only realize how oblivious Glenn is to his lecture when he's unable to answer a question from Lynn, which he bluntly responds to have no idea about. He then throws the question back at the class to figure it out on their own. I'd give this teaching experience a 1-star rating. This turn of events makes an angered Sistin scold Glenn for his incompetence. Lucky for him, he swerves the incoming wrath of Sistin when the school bell goes off and dashes out of the class, leaving the stunned students behind. Meanwhile, there's an uproar in the headmaster's office about Glenn's arrival. Hallie, for some reason, doesn't dig the recommendation of the third-level mage and expresses his worries to the headmaster, Rick, on the grounds that Glenn is not fit, nor is he qualified enough to grace the faculty of the most prestigious academy. Yet, it turns out that Hallie's biggest fear is that Glenn holds a remarkable chance of tarnishing the school's reputation. Suddenly, Celica, who happens to be a professor and one of the most powerful mages in the land, arrives, threatening to hunt down Hallie if he hurts Glenn. Upon her arrival, Hallie finally drops the issue about Glenn and exits. With no opposition, Rick demands the reason Celica wants Glenn at the school. It is revealed that she is responsible for passing Glenn's recommendation letter, and she simply responds that she wants Glenn to live a normal life. She's also willing to take responsibility for his actions. This is giving me some major mom vibes. What do you guys think? Over the next couple of hours, Glenn continuously causes chaos in the academy, peeking at the girls' changing room, which had its consequence, triggering Sistin at the cafeteria, and then back to the poor quality of his following lectures. And still, there's Sistin, continuously being a thorn in his side, and she even goes as far as threatening to get him fired. Glenn, who had taken the job against his will, couldn't be happier. However, things take an interesting turn when she proposes a challenge. Sure enough, Glenn doesn't back down, and if you think he's a horrible teacher, well, then you haven't seen him in a fight. I would have expected Glenn to take this a little bit serious. However, the match is a piece of cake for Sistin, who easily defeats him. It is profound to think losing a duel against a student would stir up some fire in Glenn. Meanwhile, events from the previous lecture day repeat themselves all over again, even worse this time around. Glenn has the book nailed against the board, and the students' questions are untended to while he relaxes. As infuriating as it may be, Sistin finally got the memo, advising Lynn not to ask more questions because their professor was a total jerk. She also goes extreme, labeling him unreliable and ignorant of the importance of magic or its benefits. But hearing this stirs up something in Glenn. He wonders why Sistin feels magic is all that important. Of course, he goes on to point out the many benefits magic has in their everyday lives, but not without expressing his demeaning mindset towards it. Also, he states that magic was a source used to kill humans. I'm guessing Glenn had a traumatic experience somewhere along the line. In the end, he declares it a total waste of time to learn magic. Upon hearing this, Sistin gives him a slap, hard, right on the face, and she storms out of the class while holding back her tears. Glenn, however, takes the hint that he may have gone overboard with it. And just then, he spots Rumia having trouble while trying to conjure magic circles by herself. Glenn, for once, decides to be useful and helps her by adding an ingredient she forgot. The result? Rumia creates a beautiful circle that also reminds Glenn about his childhood love for magic. While both of them walk home together, Glenn gives very minimal information about himself, not withholding his hatred for magic, yet he seeks to know why Rumia was so interested in it. Only then does she reveal that she was adopted by Sistin's family after an incident, and her love for magic occurred 3 years ago when she was rescued by a powerful mage after being captured by a dark sorceress. She practices beneficial magic to help people, and she hopes to one day meet her savior again. After that somewhat elevating speech, he takes a closer look at Rumia, who seemed familiar to him from the very first time they met. Before they part ways, she pleads with him to make things right with Sistin. Turns out, Sistin's passion for magic was to fulfill her grandfather's dying wish, to become a great mage and uncover the secrets of the sky castle above the city. Let's just say Glenn's conversation with Rumia hit the right spot, because the very next day at school, Glenn not only apologizes to Sistin, he also dedicates his time to teaching properly after realizing just how devoted they were. He teaches magic with a very peculiar method of language use, where he teases Sistin with words that get her flustered, and he gives her the nickname White Cat. Another intriguing part of this teaching method doesn't involve books and manuals, which he labels as an unconventional method. Yet the spells he casts without incantations turn out mind-blowing. Over time, the once gloomy professor becomes very popular in the school, so much so that students from other classes begin attending his lectures that are deemed both effective and interesting. Also, Glenn surprisingly becomes buddies with Rumia and Sistin. And then there's Celica, who notices that Glenn has been a lot happier recently. One fine morning, Glenn is suddenly ambushed on his way to work by 2 men with snake tattoos on their arms. But it seems it was merely a distraction to stall him away from class so other tattooed men could infiltrate the school and abduct Rumia. The students deny the presence of Rumia in their class, but unfortunately, it becomes overwhelming for them. It turns out the tattooed men possess a power identified as military-grade magic, proving to be highly skilled opponents. To prevent her friends from getting hurt, Rumia, whose real identity is revealed to be Princess Ermiana, finally surrenders. Meanwhile, Sistin's zeal to save Rumia gets her tied up, and just when the man is about to physically assault her, Glenn carelessly walks into the room. The moment before the man unleashes his attack, Glenn uses a card to neutralize all magic within the area. This impressive strategy shocks the man and Sistin, who are aware that no ordinary mage could pull off such a spell, also labeling it impossible for a mere level 3 mage. Now with all the magic neutralized, Glenn gives the man a severe beating in hand-to-hand combat, identified as a military-grade skill, and the man wonders, where did he learn it? Soon, Glenn gives Celica an update about the researchers of Divine Wisdom who have kidnapped Rumia and her classmates. But unfortunately, Celica's hands are tied. While they plan their next move to rescue Rumia, a skeleton army is summoned on Glenn and Sistin. Glenn, in return, is forced to use a high-level spell to destroy the army, but the use of that insane amount of power weakens him, leading him to briefly collapse in exhaustion. Suddenly, they are ambushed by another member of the Researchers of Divine Wisdom, a man possessing the magic of floating swords. Glenn doesn't get the opportunity to use his card again. Turns out, the card didn't work on magic that was preset. The man unleashes a barrage of sharp attacks at Glenn, and just then, Sistin arrives, again as assistance. To subdue the man, Glenn is pierced by the floating swords, giving Sistin the window of opportunity to disable the sword while Glenn finishes him off with military-grade combat. Considering how off these two characters were at the beginning, they actually make a pretty great team. Glenn's wound from the fight takes a toll on him, and he collapses as a result of drained energy. Sistin comes to the rescue, using her healing magic to tend to his severe wounds. And while she does so, he recalls memories from a messy battlefield, reminiscing that he once dreamt of becoming a justice mage, not a killer. After some time, Glenn gains consciousness to find Sistin passed out by his side. After he expresses his gratitude for healing him, he receives intel from Celica about the attack and rushes to go save Rumia. Soon, Glenn confronts the person responsible for the abduction, who turns out to be the student's former teacher, Huey. Huey appears to have waited for 3 long years to execute a magic circle spell that would teleport Rumia to their organization and simultaneously destroy the school building. It turns out that Rumia is an important key to the organization, and he plans to hand her over to them. Desperate to save his student, Glenn's hands are tied, and he begins breaking the magic seals one by one with his blood. Yet the fact that he hadn't fully recovered from his last battle makes him bleed profusely, and when he arrives at the last barrier, he collapses. Rumia's care for Glenn has her desperately penetrating the barrier to heal him with her magic. Thankfully, his energy is restored immediately, revealing Rumia to be an amplifier, a special individual capable of increasing a person's energy just by touching them. In return, he destroys the final seal, defeating Huey and ends it all with a nap on Rumia's thighs. That sounds soft. Later, Celica reveals that the princess's death was staged after finding out she possessed a special ability that was rendered an abomination, whereas the organization found her identity and planned to use her as a tool to destroy the Alzano Empire. The incident gradually dies down with the announcement of the upcoming Imperial Academy competition, that is to have the Queen as a special guest. The girls are super excited, except their classmates who feel they'd only lose if they participated. Despite the look of the situation, Glenn, the now good professor, offers encouragement to them. Now we're getting some character development. He proposes a strategy of splitting the class into categories to fit their abilities, and also assures them that they'll win the competition with his guidance. Glenn's enthusiasm towards his goal is, well, intense. Yeah, until we find out he's only interested in the prize money for the winner. Unfortunately for him, he didn't predict clashing with Hallie over practice space. Hallie, of course, attempts to intimidate Glenn's students, yet the scene where Glenn bets his salary for 3 months against Hallie is so beautiful that it makes Glenn weep. Now with something bigger on the line, Glenn vigorously trains his students with even more enthusiasm. And just a few days later, it's contest day. As expected, the competition starts intensely, with Glenn's students fully active and determined to win. But it's still unknown to them that their professor would rather just take the prize money and go home. As the competitions go on, Glenn's class shockingly clears each stage till it's finally Rumia's turn to participate. In the game of mental defense, Rumia receives demeaning comments from her fellow competitor, who finds her puny. However, this little girl has a strong will, proving herself to be the last man standing and winner of the competition. Meanwhile, the queen, who watched from her seat, is satisfied that her daughter settled fine with the right professor and friends. Soon enough, it is revealed that the competition is an undercover scheme to find the traitor in the queen's court, and this task is given to Riel and Albert, 2 members of the Imperial Court mages who are revealed to have unfinished business with Glenn. Number 1 on the suspect list is Zelos, the commander of the Imperial Guard. It is quite unfortunate for him that he has to be by the Queen's side throughout the competition, but you know what they say, Keep your friends close and your enemies closer. Later on, Rumia approaches a starved Glenn with a token of appreciation for his help during the competition. Suddenly, they're interrupted by Her Majesty, the Queen herself, Queen Alicia. As revealed earlier, the Queen is Rumia's mother, a mother who wishes to make things right with the daughter she abandoned 3 years ago. But how does Rumia take this? It seems Rumia didn't quite forget who the Queen was to her. Unable to accept the Queen's advances, she pretends to not be Ermiana and refers to herself as Rumia, then runs away. After the little mother and daughter encounter, the next scene has Queen Alicia being surrounded by zealous men. Unknown to them, Albert had been watching the whole situation with his magic eye, and while Riel wishes them to attack, Albert suggests they watch the situation. Elsewhere, Glenn tries to cheer Rumia after the encounter with her mother, and you would not believe what happens next. Just when Rumia was ready to face the Queen, they are suddenly approached by Imperial guards who seek to execute Rumia on the Queen's orders. What a shocker! However, Glenn resists the order, saving Rumia just in time from the Imperial guards. They retreat to a dark alley where Glenn contacts Celica through a magic bracelet. Unfortunately, she's unable to assist him as she was being monitored by members of the Researchers of Divine Wisdom. Then Celica reveals to him that Zelos forced the Queen to wear an enchanted necklace that would kill the wearer if the secret of the necklace is disclosed. As a result, Celica's hands were tied, as her priority was to ensure the Queen's and students' safety above all. Back in the alley, Glenn is tracked and ambushed by Riel when Albert arrives just in time to stop her. Both of them revealed to be Glenn's former comrades when he was a member of the Imperial Mage Corps, which also clarifies his impressive magic abilities. Together, they devise a plan to outsmart the Imperial soldiers while Albert and Riel return to the competition to help Glenn's class. Back at the arena, Sistin deals the finishing move with a mind-blowing high-level spell to defeat her opponent and lead her class to victory. The winning team from Glenn's class, of course, is granted a special meeting with the Queen. Turns out, Glenn and Rumia sneak into the competition while in the guise of Albert and Riel. Celica sets up a barrier, restricting interference from the Imperial army. Hearing Queen Alicia's words, Glenn finds her behavior suspicious and is certain she's under an influence. He subdues the effect of the necklace with a spell card, and then pulls the necklace off the Queen's neck. Just then, Queen Alicia expresses her heartfelt apology to Rumia. In the end, Queen Alicia leaves her daughter under the watch of Celica, while Rumia gets to thank the man who saved her 3 years ago. And that's Glenn, of course. Later, they join the other students to celebrate their win, and unfortunately for Glenn, he ends up using his reward money to clear the restaurant expenses. The turn of events has Sistin eager to get stronger so she can protect her foster sister's identity. Sistin's passion for her task has her seeking to learn military-grade magic from Glenn, but instead, he puts her through intense combat training. Wouldn't really blame Glenn for being reluctant though. One shouldn't really give a nuke to a child. Glenn isn't oblivious to how dangerous military-grade magic can be, and how it could consume its users. However, Glenn acknowledges her reason for learning and is quite positive it wouldn't consume her. The next day, while Glenn takes a walk with the girls to the academy, they get ambushed by Riel, who considers it a way of reuniting with old comrades. Something peculiar about Riel strikes Glenn's attention. Why on earth was an Imperial guard wearing the uniform of a female student? Then he figures that she's the guard assigned to protect Rumia undercover, although Riel makes it clear that she doesn't care about Rumia and only wishes to protect Glenn. That's a bit suspicious. At school, Riel is introduced to the class. However, she carelessly reveals her identity as a member of the Court Mage Corps and uses military-grade magic to summon a large sword during a practical course. This display gets the rest of the class scared of Riel, but Sistin and Rumia seem to be quite comfortable around her. Glenn sneakily watches the students try to make friends with Riel, but he believes she wasn't sent to merely protect Rumia, but rather to learn how to socialize with others, like regular people. Soon, Glenn and his students go for a class trip to the White Alchemy Research Lab, which, luckily for the boys, is located beside a beach. While they explore the area, Albert, who was Glenn's former teammate, warns him to be careful of the dangerous Riel. Glenn shoves Albert's warning. After all, Riel was merely an innocent, normal girl. Later on, the students have fun playing at the beach, and then in the evening, the boys in the class duel against Glenn over who gets to peep at the girls' room. The girls take Riel to play at the beach, and she looks so happy that she proceeds to call them friends. That night, while the students are asleep, Riel sneaks out to see Glenn, but not for the reason you think she would. Riel makes inquiries to know why he left the Imperial Court Mage Corps and why he abandoned her. Glenn, the smart kid that he is, swerves her questions by asking her to leave the Corps as well and start a new life as a student at the Academy. Riel doesn't give in to Glenn's suggestion. It turns out she feels insecure about his closeness with Sistin and Rumia, claiming that they snatched him away from her. Things just got super crazy. On their way to the White Alchemy Research Lab, the girls notice Riel's moody attitude and snappy responses, but Glenn easily calms the situation that Riel was merely experiencing social anxiety. When they arrive, they're welcomed by Bork, who gives them a tour of the lab and tutoring of white magic combined with alchemy. Afterward, they enter a room to observe the experimental results from the combination of white magic and alchemy. Rumia feels sad though, believing that the exhibited animals suffer as a result of the experiment. However, Bork approaches her and explains an experiment called Project Revive Life, an experiment intended to resuscitate the dead by using special elements. Glenn also arrives, stating that the experiment to revive one individual required multiple people to die, and warns Bork not to speak about the project that was cancelled years ago. However, Bork reveals that the researchers of Divine Wisdom have taken control of the Project Revive Life database and would soon perfect the experiment. This revelation only frightens poor Rumia even more. After their time in the lab, Glenn takes another shot at appealing to Riel, but instead, she runs away in a rage. Alone on the beach, Riel gets a sudden visit from her older brother, Scion. Clouded by emotions, she fails to discern why she was with a ghost, because Scion died a long time ago. Meanwhile, Albert, who had been spying on Riel with his magic eye, figures the man standing before her isn't her brother, and just when he plans to go get her, he's interrupted by Eleanor's sudden confrontation. With this crazy turn of things, Albert smartly perceives the situation, that Eleanor was meant to stall him and the man disguised as Scion was a member of the researchers of Divine Wisdom. To stop them from achieving their mission, Albert engages in a fierce battle with Elena. Meanwhile, the man disguised as Scion successfully manipulates Riel with a stunning lie, stating that the only thing that could free him was the pure magic that only Rumia possessed. Desperate to save the man who she believes to be her brother, Riel is determined at any cost and is prepared to fight anyone that stands in her way, including her sweetheart, Glenn. Just then, he arrives at the scene and tries to warn her that the man disguised as her brother is an imposter. Unfortunately, she had fallen for the imposter's tricks and returns the favor by stabbing Glenn from behind with her sword. She leaves with Scion, but not without informing Glenn that she's found a new purpose in life, and that would be living a happy life with a ghost. Riel goes ahead with her plan, abducting an unconscious Rumia, while a helpless Sistin watches in horror. With Eleanor's mission accomplished, Albert arrives at the hotel with Glenn, bleeding profusely from the lethal wound Riel inflicted on him. Albert realizes that he can't heal Glenn using ordinary healing magic, and proposes a ritual with Sistin's mana and her lips. Sorry, CPR. Later on, Glenn awakens and is thankful that yet again, Sistin saved his life. When Albert informs him about the recent situation, Glenn becomes enraged, knowing full well that Rumia was used as bait to find out the plans of the researchers. However, he makes it his priority to save Rumia and Riel. Meanwhile, the researchers, Bork, Eleanor, and Scion begin Project Revive Life by placing the amplifier, Rumia, in a machine that absorbs pure magic. And thankfully, Albert tracks them with a tracking device placed on Eleanor. Yet, apparently, Bork is one step ahead of them, summoning his chimeras to attack. But too bad his flimsy creations are no match for Glenn and Albert, who defeat them with ease. Hence, Bork goes on a rampage, transforming into a monster to attack. Realizing they were running out of time, Albert urges Glenn to go save Rumia, while he stays back to handle Bork. Meanwhile, Glenn barges into where Rumia is being held hostage, but he's confronted by Riel, along with the man disguised as her brother. Once again, he tries to reason with her, but instead, she gets furious and attacks him. Amidst the fight, Glenn asks Riel to call out her brother's name, and as expected, the question confuses her and makes her dizzy as she thinks about the answer. Glenn uses this opportunity to pin Riel to the floor with gravity magic, and also destroys the machine Rumia was kept in. A moment later, Riel's manipulation begins to wear off, and she recalls that she was a product of the Project Revive Life experiment. It turns out that the human scion was a member of the researchers who created Riel to revive his dead sister. In the past, the human scion sought Glenn's help to protect his sister from the researchers, but unfortunately, she passed on before his arrival. It is revealed that Reyna is responsible for his partner's death, Scion along with his sister. Afterward, Glenn returned to the lab and found the unconscious clone, which he took into the Imperial Court Mage Corps. The fight then takes a new turn, now with 3 more clones of Riel ordered to eliminate the enemy. In the end, after a sweet elevating speech from Glenn, Riel joins forces with him to defeat the clones. Albert also defeats Bork with a massive fire blast, and later, Glenn takes the girls back to the hotel, where they reunite with Sistin and the other students. Days after the incident, Riel settles in with the Feibel family after apologizing to Sistin and Rumia for her actions. Everything pretty much returns to normal between Riel and Glenn until the sudden arrival of a new professor, Leos. Glenn and the others receive another shocking surprise when Leos introduces himself as Sistin's childhood fiancé. Meanwhile, in the principal's office, Hallie is especially happy with Leos' presence, pointing him out as a great replacement for Glenn, but Celica is a bit suspicious. Leos quickly gains the affection of Sistin's class, except for Glenn, who finds it concerning that Leos was teaching military-grade magic without minding the risks. Later on, Leos officially asks Sistin to officially marry him, while the gang eavesdrops. Sistin turns down his proposal, expressing her need to fulfill her grandfather's dying wish. Yes, there are more pressing needs than that of Leos. Just then, Glenn, who had been spying on them, comes out to belittle him. He pretends to be in a relationship with Sistin, and in the end, proposes a duel to get Leos out of her hair. That evening, Albert informs Glenn about Angel's dust that should have been eliminated from the city, but is currently spreading. Elsewhere, it seems Leos is cooking up a plan with a mysterious man to get rid of Glenn. A few days later, the day of the duel finally arrives between Glenn and Leos, involving Class 2 going against 4. Class 4, which is Leos' class, had a higher probability of winning because of the clear difference in skill. Yet somehow, Class 2 picks up the pace with a strategic plan, also having Riel as an asset on the battlefield. The duel is called to a draw after exceeding the time limit without a winner. Leos is triggered by the results and urges for a rematch against Glenn. However, an emotional Sistin slaps him hard across the face for ignoring her decision by accepting the duel. Later that night, Sistin confronts Glenn about Sarah after she heard him murmur the name. He then discloses the story of a young boy who loved magic and dreamt of becoming a justice mage. However, when he grew up, his power became so terrifying that blood was spilled by his hands, and he decided to quit. Yet along the way, he met a girl who encouraged him to continue pursuing his dreams. It turns out that that girl is Sarah, who also looks very similar to Sistin. He reveals that he lived a happy life with Sarah, but after she was killed, he lost all interest in magic. He further explains that he accepted Leos' challenge to punish him for ridiculing her dreams. Suddenly, Leos arrives, triggering Glenn, leading to a fight between them. Leos uses a rare magic technique to defeat Glenn on the spot, and threatens to reveal Riel and Rumia's true identities if she doesn't marry him. Glenn's loss to Leos takes a toll on him, and he doesn't show up at school for several days. Soon enough, news about Sistin's wedding spreads, and though the girls don't approve of it, they are helpless, left to sit and watch Sistin's life get ruined. On the wedding day, Sistin and Leos are about to share a kiss when Glenn abruptly crashes the wedding, and take Sistine from the altar. Soon, they're surrounded by dead residents of the town who've been infected with angel's dust, and thankfully, the Imperial Court mages arrive just in time to save the students at the wedding. Meanwhile, Glenn becomes desperate to defeat Leos after recalling the same incident that happened with Sarah. He mercilessly slaughters the infected residents as they approach him, while Sistine becomes terrified after witnessing his terrifying power. Leos appears with a menacing aura and reveals himself to be Jatis, the former Imperial Corps executioner. He also reveals that he killed Leos and took his form to execute his plan to obtain the Akashic record. Glenn engages in an intense battle against Jatis, while Sistine runs to safety. On her way, she regrets her reaction towards Glenn after witnessing his lethal side, so she returns to join him in the fight against Jatis. With Sistine's support, Glenn regains his confidence and combines forces with her to defeat Jatis, who luckily escapes in the end. Later on, Glenn carries Sistine on his back and asks if he deserves to be a professor. She responds that her presence by his side is the best answer. The story ends with Glenn returning to the academy as the student's favorite professor. Yet it seems Eleanor survived and plans to also obtain the Akashic record for herself. And with that, today's recap comes to an end.